Okay, good evening. I'm Mark McNaught, and I certainly think that it's worth having a discussion about free ports with no one more qualified to speak about free ports than Mr. Alf Baird. And I'd like to first begin by defining what the free ports are. As I understand it, free ports are part of a leveling up scheme introduced by Michael Gove. Alf, what are the two ports that they wish to make into free ports?
In Scotland, it's Forth Ports and Cromarty Firth.
And there's another 8 or so in England, is that correct?
I think so. Major ports such as Felixstowe, Southampton, Liverpool. There's also an airport, I think it's West Midlands, and Humberside ports, Teesport, and I think perhaps one in Wales, perhaps, on the Severn.
What I understand, they are to be basically regulatory black holes. As I understand it, it's to be administered initially by certain councils, and then the direction of the free ports is to be handed over to a private body. Is that your understanding of the free ports?
I think the local authorities are brought into it in an administrative kind of role, but when the Freeport companies are established, the local authority will only have one seat out of 12. So yeah, the local authority is somehow a part of the administrative organisation for the Freeport, but has a relatively minor decision-making role in terms of strategy, I think.
And what are the councils, which will be, at least a very, very small part of the administration?
Well, there's multiple councils because if the first one, Cromarty, is also, I think, Port of Inverness. That's Highland Council essentially there. But on the Forth, which includes a whole range of councils in Central Region, West Lothian, City of Edinburgh, perhaps East Lothian, and Fife Council. So there's a whole range of local authorities perhaps potentially involved in that.
A while ago, I saw kind of a graph, and it showed the companies and many universities that are also, part of this. Do you understand the role of the universities would play in the free ports?
Well, I think they might be perhaps trying to participate in the fiscal advantages, if you like, from this, because there's various tax benefits through lands and building tax relief. There's buildings allowances, there's enhanced capital allowances. There's also national insurance contributions.
What is enhanced capital allowance?
I'm not an accountant, but that's for investment in plant and machinery and things like that. So that gives you benefits there. So it's accountancy benefits. There's quite a range of tax benefits there. There's also benefits in terms of maybe aspects of planning. So port authorities might be, I don't know whether it's the case, but might be minded to, they are required to include port master planning consent areas, or to have free ports involved in the master planning of what the plans are for the future development of the area, and to streamline decision making, whatever that means. So it's a new regulatory regime for these areas, providing significant tax benefits, in addition to trade, import duties suspended, customs duties exemptions, simplified import and export procedures for goods. So there's a whole range of fiscal and tax benefits for organizations involved in the Freeport.
And is there any transparency whatsoever? As I understand it, initially there was to be a kind of a collaboration, if you will, between the Holyrood government and the Westminster government. There was supposed to be consultation. However, Westminster, as usual, could always overrule the Holyrood government on the planning decisions. Is that your understanding as well?
Well, initially, the Scottish government wasn't too keen to participate in this. It is a Tory policy, remember, and the free ports policy came out of work initially done by Rishi Sunak when he was a backbencher several years ago, I think 2016.
Before he was Chancellor.
Before he was in government, really, he produced a free port, which to some extent reminded me of free port developments in Asia and other parts of the world, which are to do with transshipment hubs.
What is a transshipment hub?
Well, a transshipment hub is where goods are imported, usually by container ship, then they're processed within the port area, and then they're re-exported again by container ships or ferries and so on for other countries. So free ports are generally about serving international markets, not domestic markets. The idea is to bring in multinational corporations, for example, a transshipment hub like Singapore or Malta Freeport or these ports, Colombo, Panama, Suez Canal, free zone. These areas where big container ships are transferring cargo there for multiple markets, but not necessarily the domestic market. And this is where multinational companies can come in and have access to big warehouses there where they're storing goods, they're repackaging goods, they're maybe reprocessing goods to some extent, relabeling goods, and then re-exporting goods. And that's not what the UK free ports are about. This is about something else. I think it's a bit of a knee-jerk policy based on flat economic growth, zero economic growth in Britain. And this has happened before in Britain. Remember, back in the 80s, during the Thatcher recessions, they introduced free ports then. This is not new in Britain. It was introduced back then. And these free ports that were created back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, were to take account of deindustrialization, the need industrial diversification, and the need to grow the economy out of the tragedy of deindustrialization. You know, a completely destroyed economy in the UK. And I know that myself because I was an economic migrant at the time, had like thousands of we had to go to Germany and Spain for employment. You know, we were economic migrants at that time. So free ports are not new. It's a Tory reaction to economic collapse, if you like. Just zero growth. The economy is doing, and also the enormous trade imbalance in England, particularly.
Is there any transparency whatsoever? I mean, is there any way of knowing what companies are applying for status within it, and what they're? For example, I was reading that under the terms of the free ports, rather than having labor law such as it exists in the UK, to the extent it exists, the applying companies only need to demonstrate a commitment to fair labor practices rather than actually having law that obliges them to do so.
I'm not an employment law specialist. All I can see here is there's benefits through national insurance contributions where the employers would be exempt for salaries up to £25,000 for employees in the first 3 years. So there's not enormous benefits. DP World, who runs the container terminal in London Gateway Port on the Thames, they've calculated that, if I just have a look, they calculate the incentives for companies locating there, and there have been some companies located there, including a Belgian company that's involved in some kind of semi-processing or manufacturing. A big storage or logistics centre might have benefits of between £2 and £17 million over a 5-year period. It's not enormous advantages. That's what it's about. It's about locating, bringing in business to locate within the port area or near the port area to create traffic for the port. And that was principally the function of free ports. And this is not the role of the free ports, or what we call the green free ports in Scotland.
What's with the green bit?
Well, it's a bit of a greenwashing label, if you like. They've been labelled green in Scotland by the SNP Scottish Government just because the two port areas, Forth and Cromarty, are helping to supply, in the supply chain, all the offshore renewable wind energy developments in the east side of Scotland, particularly. So Forth and Cromarty are heavily involved in that. But the question I have is quite an obvious one. Is all these offshore renewables developments were going ahead without free port status anyway. And plus, it's not about creating large logistics centres. This is just imports of goods from other countries to then be sent out to the seabed to create the wind farms. And then after that, it's just the maintenance functions, which are relatively small scale compared to modern port developments as such. So in a sense, the free ports, the green reports, the renewables offshore developments don't need free port status. In fact, if you look at all the renewable ports on the continent, in Poland and Germany and Holland and Denmark, none of them have been made free ports. And they're supplying all the offshore wind farms, all the equipment to build these wind farms. So I don't see the logic of a free port necessarily. It's not about creating a container transshipment hub in Scotland. It's not about that at all. It's just a label added to green. There's not a lot of money involved in it. I think the port developers get about 20 million or 25 million from the UK government to help with infrastructure. At Forth and Cromarty, 25 million in port terms is relatively small. It's only enough for a modest ferry terminal, if you like.
Mhm.
It's not even enough to buy a CalMac ship. So it's not much money. And the overall benefits in employment terms and capital allowances, I don't see that as tremendously significant. It's not creating enormous flows of trade other than imports of wind turbines,
Mhm.
and then installing the wind turbines and equipment out at sea, and that's it, finished. The
Mhm.
port development then doesn't really need much additional investment once the wind farms are installed, unless more wind farms are perhaps planned. So I don't see how Freeports locks into this at all. Globally, Freeports, as I said, are about transshipment, and this is
Mhm.
not about transshipment.
What do you think it is about? I mean, being quite cynical regarding the Tories,
Well-
what are they up to? What are they up
Well,
to?
I think they've misunderstood what Freeports are, and it goes back to what I said about the Tories. They're looking at the UK with a very worsening trade imbalance, and that's a UK trade imbalance. Scotland, if we talk about that separately, doesn't have that trade imbalance. But UK as a whole has a trade imbalance where you're talking about exports of about under 400 billion a year, imports of towards 700 billion. So it has a terrible trade imbalance. And probably Sunak has looked at this and said, well, one way to do this is to do what Asian ports and other ports in the Caribbean and others have done in the Middle East, is to create free ports. But you only get the benefits of trade, growing trade, significantly if you become a transshipment hub.
Mhm.
And this is where I've worked on 2 projects before to develop transshipment hubs in Scotland. And that was because of the deep water we have at Scapa Flow in Orkney and also on the Clyde at Hunterston. And both of these projects were refused development by the UK government. They weren't supported also by the Scottish government. So it's important to recognise that the UK port planning regime is very focused on creating port developments in mainly the south of England.
Mhm.
And that's about it. But they're not ideally positioned for handling very deep draft ships, like big container ships, like Scotland is. So Scotland has perhaps another advantage here that we're not maximising at the moment.
And what are the big container ports within the UK? And does Scotland have container ports of what scale? And as you were saying, there is the deep water, so there's potential there. But
Yeah.
what can you tell us about the?
Well, the biggest ports in the UK are for container shipping are London Gateway on the Thames, Southampton, and Felixstowe and Harwich Haven in the southeast of England. Then you have the Mersey, Liverpool, which is much smaller compared to these UK hub ports. These ports all require enormous dredging costs. They incur enormous dredging costs. There's permanent dredges, I think, in Felixstowe, where the recent dredge, I think, more than 100 million. So dredging costs are a significant part of this. What we have in Scotland is potential for container ports at Scapa Flow in Orkney and Hunterston, where, as I say, these port developments have been relatively blocked and not supported by central government. Scotland has a small container port, one at Greenock on the Clyde, which is relatively modest flows of container shipping, and a Grangemouth on the Forth, which handles, as far as I remember, about 200,000 containers a year, which is equivalent to what the port of Reykjavik handles in Iceland. So it's relatively modest. What we've not seen, and I say this as a former shipping clerk in Leith going back to the 70s, is we've not seen investment in seaports in Scotland for a very long time. So most of Scotland's trade is dependent on ports in the south of England. And that means we incur additional logistics, land access costs, and delays because of that. And we've not been able to develop our international connections.
What would be the best location in Scotland for a good sized deep water port that could that would be functional? And
the Scapa Flow project was a project I was heavily involved in, also funded by the European Commission, a lot of the research on that. And we were able to track a lot of the container ships coming through the Pentland Firth, going transatlantic to different trades, US East Coast, Canada, Caribbean, South America, and even through Panama Canal. And these ships then head on to Hamburg, Bremerhaven, and into the Baltic too. And Scapa Flow there was very well positioned and as a transshipment hub, also for the Nordic Atlantic areas, Iceland, Greenland, Russia, Norway, and so on. And we envisaged that that port could easily handle or develop 1 million containers a year, could double Scotland's international trade to about 20 billion, another 20 billion pounds worth of trade, create logistics capacity also for different products such as seafood, which is a very big product in the North Atlantic, and create a new international trading connection for Scotland. Because that's one of the virtues of transshipment hubs for a host economy, which might be a small economy like Malta or so on. It creates global connections. So it makes your economy much more attractive for inward investment, for development, and also for a small free port that might be located within the port itself for logistics activities there to grow more traffic. But the basic benefit of Scapa Flow was it has over 20 meters of natural deep water in a 100 square mile anchorage. It's perfect in that sense. Another port development that I worked on was to create a new ferry and unitized and passenger port on the Firth of Forth on the site of the former power station at Cockenzie. And that could be developed relatively quickly. It's currently not being promoted as a port. It's being blocked by the local authority and the Port Authority, which is a private port company offshore registered now. So we don't really have a national port plan. And this is the problem in Scotland. We've not had a national port plan very long time, if we've ever had one. This is a real problem for developing trade, because without a national port strategy, you can't really seriously develop your economy.
And what sort of rail infrastructure or road infrastructure would need to be developed?
The actual terminal at Cockenzie and to the east side of Edinburgh, it's very close to the open sea. It's already rail connected. It was a power station, Mark. Yep. It has railway connections already. So it's possible to have rail intermodal connections through to central Scotland, to the north as well. And also we plan to have barge connections upriver and also across to Fife to service the massive whiskey industry that's based in Fife, that you can have a barge connection across the river. Just like most European cities have these barge services as well as rail, such as the Seine, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Hamburg, and so on. You have multimodal facilities, trimodal facilities, and that's what Cockenzie should be. It also prevents the bigger ships having to go further upriver to Rosyth or Grangemouth, which is a lot of extra steaming time, and also the bridge constraint, the 3 bridges, or the rail bridge is the main constraint, 43 meters air draft, which is too small for big ferries and cruise ships. So the infrastructure further up the river isn't suitable. The channel, which is insufficient for the biggest ships. Infrastructure has not been developed in Scotland for ports. Hudderston on the west coast is a natural deep water iron ore and was coal terminal as well, handling very large quantities. And that could also be developed as a container port. And Clydeport were considering doing that before they were acquired by an English company, Mersey Docks and Harbour Company. And once Mersey Docks and Harbour Company bought over Clydeport, they pushed all the development investment focus on the Mersey. And that's where they created a container terminal. Despite the fact the Mersey has insufficient depth and required enormous dredging expense, which was paid for by the UK Treasury, by George Osborne, largely paid the dredging costs on the Mersey at the time, if I remember right, under this kind of levelling up idea about the northwest.
I wanted to move on to another subject regarding possible Scottish readmission to the single market, or the EEA, and it may be through the EU, it could be through EFTA. Those things are being decided. Of course, Scotland was part of the EU; they conformed to all of the different the EEA requirements at the time. But I fear that but the speed at which Scotland is able to get into either or into the EEA or the single market will depend on how much regulatory divergence has occurred before application. And so the more that there are these regulatory divergences or these regulatory black holes that are created by things like free ports, the more difficult that makes it to get back into the EEA or the European Economic Area, or basically the single market. Do you share that view?
I think there is a concern maybe that these are creating kind of like offshore tax havens, but the fact is that within Europe, I think there's quite a number of free ports across Europe. I think there's about 70 actually. Mm-hmm. Most of them are relatively small free zones located in ports, and their function is more or less, as I said, to bring in goods to process them, to repackage them, relabel, and re-export them. They're not for the domestic economy. Rishi Sunak has misinterpreted the role of free ports here. And also it happened under the Thatcher regime as well. The Tories did exactly the same before. As I said, back in the 80s, they created a whole range of free ports, including free zones in Mersey and I think London again. These eventually, the legislation just ran out of time. I mean, there was a time limit to these free ports. I can't remember what it was, 25 years or whatever. But around about 2000 and before 2010, the free zone status expired. Prestwick Airport was also a free zone in Prestwick Airport near Glasgow. And that was a very innovative idea because Prestwick was considered by global logistics experts and people involved in transshipment research. So I've discovered it myself because I was involved in that research. And a lot of them were transport geographers. And you've got aviation hubs like Anchorage. It's handling a large volume of goods with aviation on the polar routes. And this is where Prestwick was ideally positioned to link into that, to do what basically Keflavik does in Iceland, which is a transfer point, a mid-Atlantic load center, if you like. All the goods coming across, all the passengers, it's mainly passengers in Keflavik. But Prestwick could have had a role, not just for passengers, but also freight. And that would have been a good idea. Another transshipment hub that's opened up actually not far from Anchorage on the US or Canadian west coast, northwest is Prince Rupert Port. And that's a container transshipment point, but it's rail intermodal. So you've got big ships coming in from Asia, and it's the first port in through the Aleutian chain where the ships hit the Americas. And they can discharge cargo quickly there and put it on rail intermodal to the Midwest and even the Eastern Seaboard. And into the US, and that gets a lot of volume into that area quicker than via, say, San Francisco or even Tacoma, Seattle, Vancouver. So Scapa Flow was in that kind of area, and most of the transshipment hubs around the world, we have to remember as well, were former naval bases. They were naval bases because they were at strategic intersections between seas and oceans, canals. So, Algeciras, Gibraltar, Suez Canal, Malta, Colombo, Singapore, Hong Kong, so on, Panama, it just goes on and on. And this is where Scapa Flow was very important because it's right at the entrance to the North Sea and also on the route into the Baltic Sea, where a lot of the biggest ships can avoid, in some cases, the congestion and the shallow ports around the North Sea basin and the English Channel.
But if these free ports are not being used for shipments, as you were saying, where they come in repackaged and sent out or whatever, but it's more for the domestic market and it's unregulated, would that not pose problems for aligning with European regulations?
I think the classic problem these free port ideas or free zones have created is whether they're just going to take business from the local economy into the free zone to avoid paying taxes, to avoid paying rates, to avoid paying national insurance. So they just become they get these advantages, and that just reduces the tax take of the central government in a sense. I think there is that worry. I just think the Tories have completely mistaken and totally ignored the reality of free ports, which are linked to transshipment hubs, not domestic. Yeah, and the green free port, of course, in Scotland is just a complete misnomer. It's a pointless exercise because not only do we not need free ports at these places because they're not handling container trade in any big volumes for third countries, is they don't need to be free ports at all for the green, for the offshore renewables, because these developments are going ahead anyway.
Speaking of the Tories, as you correctly pointed out, this is very much a Tory policy. And I was going through the ScotGov website talking about free ports, and got a very nice, polite letter from writing from Michael Gove to Kate Forbes. Oh, this is great. We're cooperating on the free ports. A similarly effusive letter from Kate Forbes saying, "Oh, it's wonderful. We're working together." So in theory, they're supposed to be collaborating on this. But I saw I think I caught in some of the Scottish press that the Scottish government has found that they're not. collaborating, or they're not cooperating. They're just pushing through whatever their policy. So it brings up the question: is why is the Scottish government cooperating, given that it's a Tory policy? What are your views on that?
There's obviously a difference in, or there should be, you would assume, a difference in approach from London and Edinburgh being a nationalist administration in Scotland. But essentially, they're just implementing a Tory policy here and adding a spin to it with the greenwashing aspect of it, which is totally irrelevant. What Edinburgh should be doing is developing a ports policy to develop port infrastructure in Scotland, which is geared to developing trade. And that's not what they're doing. And the two port projects that I've advocated strongly, as I mentioned, are Scapa Flow for international container transshipment hub traffic, and Mackenzie for domestic, for ferry traffic, for also container feeder maybe, but also cruise shipping and other related activities. So this is what we don't have. It still means that most of Scotland's economy is dependent on seaports in the south of England. Mm-hmm. Most of Scotland's trade goes there. And it goes back to also the function of Scotland. Much of our trade is supplying England, as it were, or the rest of the UK. And that includes renewable energy, oil and gas, other goods, aggregates. And most of the whiskey goes south as well to get exported from there. And I've calculated that that's quite a significant value. It should be in excess of 100 billion a year quite soon. And our import logistics activities all come in through England's supply chains. So Scotland is served practically entirely by London business, if you like, London corporate entities. And all its exports are drained out at relatively low value. That's the other thing about our current situation, is our exports are taken out of the country at low prices. Whether that's renewable energy, we don't see any value. Oil and gas, we don't see any value, really. Whiskey, we get quoted some figures, but actually the retail value of whiskey is probably 5 or 6 times what we hear it is, what the export data is. And then we have a whole range of other things that's supplied to London-based industries, like the retailers, the supermarkets, and so on. And then everything coming into Scotland, practically retail spend, comes in through, as I said, England's logistics centres, England's ports. So we're kind of held captive in that economic environment, whereas we would have enormous advantage in Scotland if we could control these assets and actually sell these goods to the wider market as well at better prices, and also to source goods in the wider market directly into Scottish ports from international markets at lower prices.
Okay, Alf, I'd like to get on to the dangers of these free ports, assuming I don't know what state they're at this point, in terms of development. I don't know what, and I don't know that there's any transparency whatsoever in the applications that they're making, but how do you see it?
It's a new regulatory regime. It's not been tested. We don't quite know what the effects are going to be. Even local authorities dealing with these free ports in Scotland have produced internal reports saying they don't quite know what the outcomes are going to be. So nobody is really sure about what the eventual outcomes will be of these free ports. Nobody has done any really detailed analysis of what the outcomes will be. All I can say is that the Tories have done this before. It's not new. They've done it back in the 80s, creating a range of free ports, quite similar kinds of fiscal incentives and tax advantages and other benefits. And by all accounts, the strategy was mostly a failure. So I think some people might read a lot into this in terms of deregulation and everything. And I think there is a worry there. We don't quite know the outcomes, what the outcomes will be. But we do know that the last time the Tories did this and created free ports, it didn't really do very much for the British economy. It didn't create a new competitive environment. This is the problem. Our problem in Scotland particularly is we don't have advanced seaports. And I think this is where free ports around the world are linked to new, modern, sophisticated, competitive national seaports. Mm-hmm. So you'll see this in African countries, in Middle East countries, in Asian countries, in Caribbean islands, and so on. Ports are generally connected and created to support the development of new port infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what Scotland is not getting. It's not getting new port infrastructure to serve international markets. That's why I would link perhaps a free port to something like the Scapa container terminal. If that was a transshipment port serving 20 countries around Northern Europe, handling big ships as well as feeder ships, bringing in new trade, that might be attractive. But essentially what the Scottish government and the British government are trying to do in the UK is not the same thing. And it didn't work before, and I don't think it will work again. And that's pretty much it. But I think that the other issue here is to do with port governance.
Basically management of the port itself.
Yeah, the role of the public sector and the private sector within ports. And going back to port privatization in the UK back in the early 1990s, I did quite a lot of research on that, which was also used by the World Bank and UN agencies such as UNCTAD and ECLAC. And it's important to recognize that the UK went further than any other country. Usually ports just concession out the cargo handling operations.
Right.
So you bring in somebody like AP Moller or DP World to invest in the terminal, cranes, the equipment, some infrastructure, run the terminal, but you retain a public port authority. So the Port of Le Havre, for example, or the Port of Dunkirk in Marseille, they're a public port authority. They're part of the state. And then they concession the terminal out to maybe private operators. But the state regulate the port, the state invest in the infrastructure. So the private sector are coming in, maybe buying or installing the cranes, the superstructure. So there's a divide between infrastructure and superstructure. And this is the common concession model globally, throughout the EU and globally. And what the UK did was different in two respects. It sold not just the cargo handling function, it sold the property rights, the land, and it sold the port authority as well. So it gave the regulator to the new private company. So what we have in the UK is these port estuaries are run by private groups that are now owned by offshore consortia. So Forth is owned by offshore equity funds that were Cayman Island, now also Canadian pension funds, any fund that wants
whatever's got money,
an easy profit. It's got a monopoly. It's got all the land. It's got all the regulation. It's got a whole monopoly. What the Tories did back in the 80s and 90s was they in transport generally is they sold off all the property rights. The problem we have in Scotland is these property rights under the claim of right, the common good, are held by, in the common good, they're held by the people. So there's a question whether they have the right to do this. And also going back, previous regimes took the ports, say for example, on the Forth, there's maybe 10 different ports. These were owned by the boroughs at one time. Towns.
The boroughs, yes. The boroughs.
They were owned by the communities. This is the same as the continental model even today. The communities own the ports. The North Continent in general and Scandinavia, you'll find that mostly it's the municipalities, the cities, Hamburg, so on, Rotterdam, that control the port. And this is where London policy basically transferred the rights of the port owners, being the boroughs, first of all to trust ports, which are basically a semi-corporate entity, it was an English kind of model, and then subsequently to privatization. So I think we need to focus much more on the governance of these port infrastructures, which we've seen lack of investment in.
How would you characterize this free port scheme in general? How do you think it will go? And above all, what can Scots do to stop it and to and also to bring out attention to it?
I think one of the problems in maritime policy generally in Scotland and Britain is that that's really determined by civil servants. And what I noticed on the continent in most of my EU projects over more than 20 years was that quite often the officials dealing with ports had some education in maritime policy. They were educated. They knew what they were doing. Yeah. They usually had a master's degree in port economics, port policy, shipping economics, something like that. Whereas in Scotland, we get civil servants coming from education, from social work, from employment, coming into maritime, ferries as well. And they don't really have sufficient basis. They don't have any theoretical knowledge. So they end up making policy blunders. And I think that's fundamentally what we have with this free port policy. We don't have a port policy in Scotland, and now we have a free port policy imposed that's very poorly thought out and isn't really sensible. It's been rebranded green for obviously simplistic and inadequate reasons. So it's not a workable thing. What needs to be done? Well, I think Scotland really needs a maritime policy. Any country with a coastline and ports needs a maritime policy, because it's basically a trade policy. And without good quality, competitive international seaports, you can't develop your trade. And this is the problem for Scotland. Within the UK, its trade role is really to serve the core nation, which is England largely.
Yeah.
Its role is to serve that. And this is why all our trade is oriented towards England, largely, and all our imports are coming from England. And what all the former colonies did was reorientate their trade away from London. And that's not just Ireland. That also included Canada.
Yeah.
They had to focus their trade on Asia, the Middle East, Africa, globally. And they had to stop sending everything through London, because all their goods were going to London cheap, and all their goods were coming back from London expensive. And this is what makes a colonial model or the internal colonial model dysfunctional. It leaves an economy uncompetitive, lacking development, and its people can't move out of the rut they're in. And this is what explains Scotland's lack of development, economic growth for so long. Like all the colonies, decolonisation, Mark. We know it as independence. We know it as independence, but the UN tell us independence for non-self-governing territories is decolonisation. And that includes economic umbilical cords. And the economic umbilical cord is what's constraining Scotland.
All right. Thank you so much, Alf. And thank you, Peter, for recording and editing. And thanks so much, Alf.
Thanks, Mark.